Alright, why don't you have a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Let's continue with Consult the Doctor. I have 3 questions that I was asked and 1 question that I asked myself and that I thought that I would also address here today. Let's start off with number 1. I'm writing down timestamps. Are eyedropper pens the best for flex writing and anti-railroading? This is a question that I have tried to give a lot of thought, and I have not come up with a clear answer. So there are certain advantages to eyedropper pens, and the second question will also address eyedropper pens. I think the biggest advantage, and in my mind the only advantage actually, is that you have a large ink capacity. For flex writing, which uses a lot of ink because you have the tines of the nib spreading open and putting a lot of ink on the paper, I could imagine that large ink capacity is desirable. Period. Now, another thing that I think is a problem with flex writing is that more often than not, especially with modern pens, you run into issues of the pen running dry, the pen railroading. If you don't know what railroading is, it's simple. You just get 2 thin lines instead of 1 thick line filled in with ink, because the 2 tines are just, they spread out, they just create these 2 little lines, but there should be ink in between those lines, and you don't always get that, again, especially on modern pens. Why is that? Well, that's the eternal discussion. I'm not going to have that again because we have had that discussion in a previous episode of Consult the Doctor. But the art of making proper flex nibs seemed to have been lost a bit. Now, irrespective of that, there are other factors that come into play. For example, the feed. Ebonite feeds typically work a little better than plastic feeds. Now, why doesn't everyone use ebonite feeds? That's addressed in a previous episode as well, indexed with topics on my website. But having said all that, I think another issue that you can run into is the issue of air exchange. A flex nib uses, or flex pen I should say, uses a lot of ink, and that means that a lot of ink goes out, right? But that also means that a lot of air has to go back into the ink reservoir, because otherwise you draw a vacuum and no more ink is coming out of your pen. So from that perspective, I do think that maybe an eyedropper has a little bit of an advantage simply because, and this is pretty far-fetched, simply because I have found that especially with converters, for some reason, in my experience, air leaks or problems with air exchange are a little bit more common than in other filling mechanisms. You have a converter, it has a nipple, it slides over the end of the feed, and if there's just a little bit of an issue there, a little bit of air leaking, you can get those kinds of vacuum issues. With an eyedropper, there is nothing, right? There is nothing connected to the feed. It's just a feed with an ink reservoir just on top. There's just ink on top of that. I suppose maybe a case could be made that eliminates that minor issue that you have with some converters, not all, some pens, not all, and that from that perspective and following that reasoning, maybe for a flex nib to end railroading, an eyedropper pen might be ideal. Having said that, some vintage pens were eyedroppered. Think of safety pens, for example, with nibs that you can withdraw or retract, I should probably say. But other vintage flex pens just had a sack, right? And a lever filler, for example. And they're not eyedroppered, but I suppose there is still no real connection between the feed and that filling system. It's just a sack that holds ink, and anyway. So having said that, that would be my answer. I don't think it's a very definitive answer, but I would love to hear your opinion on it, because I kind of keep teetering between yes, maybe it would be, and no, maybe it's not. And so anyway, I don't have an answer. That's my most reasoned through answer. The second question that I did not receive, but I will answer anyway, relates to this. So, timestamp. Why do people obsess so much over eyedroppering pens? This is not a question I received, but this is just a reaction of mine to a lot of questions I receive. Pretty much every time I review a plastic pen or an acrylic pen or a resin pen, whatever, at some point or another, someone is going to ask on that review, but can it be eyedroppered? Every single time. And I have to admit that I don't fully understand it. When I started out using fountain pens and I learned about the idea of eyedroppering, there were some pens that I eyedroppered, but those were mostly dedicated pens. For example, Noodler's had the I forget what the name of that model was. You get it with certain of their larger bottles of ink. It's just a clear barrel and you eyedropper it. But that pen was designed to do that. A lot of Indian pens and a lot of Noodler's pens are Indian pens, require eyedroppering, and that's fine and that works. But remember, that is a dedicated pen that is meant to be eyedroppered. When it comes to can you eyedropper a now I don't have anything clear. A Sailor 1911. Can you eyedropper a Parker Duofold? Can you, etc.? Well, often you can't. The pens are not meant to work that way. That means that they often don't have O-rings, or they don't have threads that are really meant or designed that way, but you could put some silicone grease on the threads, sure. But then they have an end cap that's a separate piece, and ink may seep out. Then you have to see if you can unscrew that and put silicone grease there too. There may be metal parts on the inside which could corrode. I don't believe I've ever really had metal parts of a pen corrode just because of ink exposure. But having said that, an ink is a liquid and exposed metal parts could corrode. A lot of pens have some sort of metal on the inside. Not all of them do, but think about it. You have a barrel, a metal ring, and an end cap. That metal ring may or may not be accessible on the inside of the barrel. If it is, then that's exposed to ink. That could corrode. That could affect the ink that comes out of the pen. In fact, that will typically affect the ink that comes out of the pen. And I have had that happen because I introduced a ball agitator into a specific converter, I think, that ball agitator turned out to not be corrosion resistant, so the ink changed color. It was very unpleasant. What I don't understand is why people have the need to eyedropper pens that were not designed to be eyedroppered. I don't think that the 30 seconds that it takes you to open an ink bottle, dip the pen in, use the converter, close the ink bottle, put the barrel back on the section, and write is that much of a time investment. Now, I fully realize that you increase the capacity of your pen. But do you write through 3, 4, 5, 6 milliliters of ink a day? Maybe you do. And if you do, then I fully understand that that's something you would be looking for. But then I wonder, would it not make sense to purchase a pen that is dedicated to eyedropper filling? And that could be a very expensive pen. Think of some of the Japanese pens and the Miki Emperor. Think of many of the Danny Trios. But again, there also are affordable Indian pens that you can eyedropper and that are meant to be eyedropper. They don't take any other filling mechanism. Would that not make more sense? Rather than putting ink in a pen that was not designed to accept ink in that way. So this was not meant to sound angry or something, but I don't fully understand what the obsession is with filling pens in a way that was not designed for that specific pen. Because I don't recall questions along the lines of, oh, that's a nice sedan, can I do Formula One with it? I don't people ask that question, right? I don't think people do that. But then when it comes to any type of plastic pen, can it be eyedroppered? I personally don't get it, and this is not at all meant as an attack on anyone. I just don't understand the reasoning, and that's why I asked this question. Yes, you'll have a larger ink capacity, but in my mind, the disadvantages, which are possible corrosion, possible leakage, just ink seeping through. I've had a pen that was a solid plastic barrel. I forget which model it was. I just remember the occurrence. Solid plastic barrel, one piece. I filled it up with ink. I put silicone grease on the section. I thought, on the threads. I thought this is going to work as an eyedropper. This was early on. I closed it. I hold it nib down, and all the ink just flows out through the nib. There was something in that which is not set up to take ink that way. I have had, I think it was a Pilot Petit one of the very small pens that take small cartridges. I had eyedroppered it with a little O-ring. The O-ring snapped and the ink went everywhere. I was on a train. I had no access to water. I had one little cloth with me. There was ink everywhere. It was on my clothes. There's nothing I could do. I don't really understand why you would open yourself up to that risk by, again, using a product in a way that was not prescribed for that product. I'm sorry if I sounded ranting. I definitely didn't want to sound angry, because I'm not angry. I just don't understand it. So maybe someone can explain to me why it is so important to be able to use a pen in a non-prescribed manner. Next question. This question actually resolved itself, but I just wanted to reason through it because I think it's educational. Someone wrote to me and said, I'm expurgating a little bit, but I didn't use my emotion for weeks. I washed the nib and feed with water and soap to get dried ink out. I reassembled it, and I have issues with ink flow. What has happened? And then I asked, well, what is the issue? Because do you have too little or too much ink flow? And the story was, if I remember correctly, well, it runs dry very quickly. So it was, let's say, too little ink flow. What could have happened? Disassembling a pen is, if it can be done, often fairly straightforward. Reassembling a pen, not necessarily so. So let's start with the issue of the pen is now too dry. What could have happened? While assuming that everything was properly dried off and there was, etc., what could have happened? Well, a couple of things. A nib and a feed together form a delicate system. You have a feed, it has a channel on top. You have a nib, it has a channel on top, and those two need to align pretty perfectly. A nibmeister would align them perfectly for you. Now, if they're off a micrometer, in my experience, it doesn't necessarily matter that much, but they should be as much on top of each other as possible, because again, it's a delicate system. If you have, I'm really exaggerating now, but if you have reassembled your pen, your nib and feed like this, not straight, but just a little bit off, that could already lead to trouble. Now, in some pens, that's not so easy because you have a nib collar, which has a groove cut out for the nib, and you can't put it in the wrong way. It has to stay that same way. That's great. But for certain pens, that's not the case at all, and things work a little differently. For example, the old Omas pens had a nib collar. I think it was ebonite or plastic. I do know that they're pretty fragile, so you have to be very careful. An ebonite feed and a gold nib. And you could easily pull out the nib and feed, and that collar is just a round piece with threads in it. Now, I have been in a situation a couple of times with different Omas models where I simply could not, because there's no cutouts or grooves, I simply could not get the nib and feed back into that collar in a way that worked. It fit in one way, and I just couldn't do it. And what you end up with then, and it's always a little hard to move both my hands this way, but what you end up is something like this. There is a gap, a physical gap between the nib and the feed. If that is what you have, now this is very exaggerated, it could be a much smaller gap, but a gap like that will ensure that your pen does not write anymore. Why? Because there's no contact between the nib and the feed. The nib touches paper, and through capillary action it kind of pulls ink out of the reservoir, which flows through the feed, and then ends up in the tip of the nib. At the tip of the nib, there's no more feed, right? So you have that channel on top of the feed, you have the channel in the nib, and those two should align, and then that ink gets pulled out and is put on the page, no problems. With the Omas pens, I couldn't do it. I often couldn't do it. I couldn't get that nib and feed back into that collar. That was one specific way, and I don't think I ever truly mastered the art. So it was the great Paul from Akkerman in the Netherlands who helped me out. He could do it. I couldn't do it. He could do it. So that is one thing that could happen. You can have created a gap between the nib and the feed, and that will lead the pen, often when you just ink it up, there's a little bit of liquid ink suspended in that gap because it's liquid, and initially it'll write, but then it'll stop writing. So make sure nib and feed are aligned properly and that there is no gap between them. Off the cuff, those are two things that I would say are very important and can make a pen dry, or start off and then dry out, possibly to completely not writing anymore as you write. Now, as I mentioned before, air exchange issues are also a thing, but because this pen wrote before the cleaning, that was not an issue, right? Unless the converter has been damaged in the cleaning process and no longer fully fits on the feed, that should not be a problem. Now, what about the other way around? What if you have the situation where a pen is too wet, there is too much flow? Well, there's a couple of things that could happen. One thing that may have happened, and that is especially the case I find if you get blobs of ink, so you're writing and then a drop of ink just basically falls out of the pen onto the page. Often I found what is the case in that scenario is that you have not pushed the nib and feed in far enough. They go into a nib collar, and the nib collar goes into the section. If you don't push the nib and feed far enough into that nib collar, they're not where they should be, they're not far enough, there's a space and some ink collects there, and at some point it falls out. That's just a gap somewhere, and it makes the pen bleed ink, so to speak. And that is not always easy to spot. So what do when you typically push a nib and feed back into a collar? You have to be very careful because the nib can bend, right? But you also want to make sure that you have pushed it all the way in. And one way I found that makes it a little easier to do that is to just dip the nib and feed into some water, because the water will act as a bit of lubrication and it'll be easier to slide the nib and feed in the collar, easier than doing it dry. And of course you also have a little bit of water in the nib and feed, so the ink may be diluted a bit, so maybe just let it dry overnight or really use a tissue to wipe it down. So that is, in my mind, definitely one thing, that you just haven't pushed the nib and feed in far enough. There's not a good fit between the nib and feed and the collar, and ink will just leak out somewhere. The final thing I will say is, when you are using, I wouldn't use soap to clean nibs and feeds, but you can use dishwashing detergent. But dishwashing detergent has an interesting property. It can act as a surfactant, and what you obtain in a case like that is a much wetter ink. So if you can easily do an experiment, take a very dry ink that you own. I think of something like B.R.E. It's quite affordable and it's very dry. Well, it's dry, I shouldn't say very, it's dry as the dry ink. Take a little sample vial, put that ink in, and then put just a drop, just one drop of dishwashing detergent in, swirl it around a bit, ink up your pen with that. It'll gush out. It will gush. Some people use that trick to make an ink wetter, but then you don't even use a drop. You basically just put something like a needle in dishwashing detergent, put that needle into your sample vial. That's enough. That's how little you need, right? If you have cleaned your nib and feed with water and dishwashing detergent and you have not then properly flushed that feed, I suppose theoretically you could run into an issue because you have that detergent residue that just wettens the ink, makes it wetter, and it will flow out like crazy. So if you use dishwashing detergent, which I always do on a new pen, because sometimes you have machine oil residue in a feed, and dishwashing detergent really clears that out, just dilute it with some water, but then after that, flush it through with just regular clean water. Doesn't have to be distilled, doesn't have to be any of those things, but make sure that that dishwashing detergent truly is out of the pen, because it will make your ink a lot wetter to the point of it being unpleasant. Like again, do that experiment with the one drop. You'd be surprised at what an effect that has. Anyway, this was a long answer. I hope this was interesting. I thought it might be worth it to reason through that process. So I hope I haven't bored you to death. Final question is a question that I'm sure was partially tongue-in-cheek, but I'm thinking partially also not. Why do North American pen vloggers have extra large glasses that are bigger than bottles in Europe? Is this compensation? I'm not quite insecure about what size my pen is, but having said that, I know this may not be of interest to everyone. That's why I saved this question for last, right? But as a European now living in North America, I can say one or two things about that. And it's, in my mind, quite interesting because this was new to me as well. The short answer is yes, things are bigger in North America, but the scale here is quite different from Europe. So I haven't looked this up, but this is my teacup travel mug, which I use for tea. It's big. It is big. It's a Yeti. I think this thing is called the Rambler, and I forgot what the exact contents of it are. But I'll show you another example. When I was growing up in Europe, if you would buy a bottle of soda, or as we say here, pop, it was 1.5 liters. That was the biggest bottle of Coca-Cola, Fanta, like these kinds of things you could get. But here it's 2 liters, right? It's 2 liters. You can get smaller, but this I would say is the pretty standard size. I'll give you 2 more examples. One I can show you, one I can't show you. This I would say, this is very Canadian by the way, craft. This is a very standard container of peanut butter in Europe. This is what you go to the supermarket, the grocery store, this is what you buy. This is a Canadian, North American size container. This is 2 kilograms of peanut butter. This is a normal size. There's nothing absurd about this. Everything is this size. You buy everything in a bigger size. I'm not going to provide value judgments. I'm just saying the scale here is different. The scale of the country is different. The scale of products is different. And one of my favorites is you can go to a place called 7-Eleven, which is sort of a combination of a gas station and a convenience store, typically. And you can buy cups, you plastic, just single-use cups, disposable cups that you fill up from a fountain with soda. And I think the biggest size they have a gulp, and then they have a big gulp. And a big gulp is 3.79 liters of a soft drink. That's a gallon, right? So 3.79 liters is close to 2 of these bottles, because this is 2 liters, right? And that's a single drink. That's a single serving size, a portion. I'm definitely not going to provide value judgments on that, but it's just an illustration to show you that yes, things are bigger here. It's true. And I mean, I can still purchase this, right, if I don't want to purchase that. So it's not a big deal. Now, I like to think that this question was kind of half tongue-in-cheek. But there is a reality behind it. And the reality is the products that you purchase here are bigger. They are likely bigger. And it's a well-known thing, right, that in North America you can supersize things. If you go through a drive-through and you buy, I'm just going to use the term junk food, right? You just buy a burger and fries. You can supersize it. And in some fast food restaurants, the sizes of those meals are insane and basically contain all the calories you need in one day or more. Again, I'm not providing value judgment. I'm just saying that's the way it is, right? Now you make up your mind how you feel about that. That's it. So thoughts from a European living in Canada/North America, that's really what it's like. And I'm sure that people from North America coming to, and this is everything, right? It's even shampoo. You buy a 1 liter or 2 liter bottle of shampoo. Like, I'm sure it's the other way around too. People coming from North America into Europe must think like, what the hell is this? Like, what am I going to do with this, right? So it works that way around as well. I hope that has been, I know it had nothing to do with pens, but because I do actually get that question once in a while of, is that cup that big, or is it distortion of the camera? No, it is that big. It is. Period. I hope this was of some interest, and I'll gladly see you again next time for more questions. Bye.